Hi, I'm Annie with ByAnnie.com and Patterns by Annie. In this video, I will show you how to make a carrying strap pad for a bag. Many ByAnnie bags have adjustable detachable carrying straps that allow you to wear the bag over the shoulder or crossbody and to remove the strap if desired. On larger bags, it's helpful to pass that strap through a pad which can be worn on the shoulder. This pad helps to anchor the bag and also adds some cushioning, making carrying easier and more comfortable. The pad is very easy to make, but there are a few tricks for achieving a beautiful, professional finish when binding its edges. We'll cover those in this video. Any ByAnnie pattern that calls for a carrying strap pad will include complete instructions for cutting and assembly of the pad, as well as labels for the pieces. So please refer to the instructions in your pattern to prepare those pieces. In this video, I am making a pad for a bag made using our pattern Ultimate Travel Bag 2.0. The process will be the same for any of our other bag patterns that include a strap pad. Let's get started. To make a carrying strap pad, you will need the pieces for the carrying strap pad, which were cut from quilted fabric according to the pattern instructions, and bindings, both cross-grain and bias, which were cut according to the pattern instructions. The pad itself is made of 3 pieces of quilted fabric, which you created by quilting the main and lining fabrics with Soft and Stable. There are 2 long strips and a shorter strip. Their sizes are determined by the width of your carrying strap. Again, you'll find complete cutting instructions and labels for your pieces in your pattern. The 2 long strips will be layered on the bottom to give extra padding to the strap pad. The shorter strip will be bound on each short end, then it will be centered on top of the 2 long strips and sewn in place, creating a channel through which the carrying strap will be passed. This channel will hold the strap in place and allow the pad to be moved as the length of the strap is adjusted. Once the pieces are joined, the corners will be rounded. Having rounded corners makes it much easier to bind the raw edges. Because the corners are rounded, we need to use bias binding to bind the outside edges. Binding cut on the bias has more stretch and is essential to achieving a beautiful, smooth, wrinkle-free binding. Prepare the bias binding according to the pattern instructions. Then fold it in half with the right side out, aligning the edges, and pin it every 2 to 3 inches to secure. Pinning rather than pressing helps make the binding smoother and eliminates wrinkles. I recommend that you do this with the binding laying flat on the table so that you really keep the edges aligned. Crooked pieces are apt to cause wrinkles when the binding is attached. Okay. Our binding is pinned and we're ready to stitch it in place. Let's talk first about where to start stitching. I prefer to attach the binding completely by machine, and I want the front to look the best when I'm done. So I will sew the binding first to the wrong side of the pad. This is the side that is just one long piece of fabric. The shorter piece with the bound edges will be on the underside at this point. I'm going to start stitching about 1 inch in from one of the corners. I start here because it will give me the most room for joining the ends once the binding is attached. This is a small piece and there's not going to be much room anywhere, so we want to give ourselves as much room as possible. I'm going to leave about a 3 to 4 inch tail so that I have room to work when I join the ends later. The tail should be aligned about in the middle of the pad. Make sure that you have engaged the needle down function on your machine. Having the needle always stop in the down position makes a big difference when binding. Align the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of the pad and begin sewing about 1 inch in from the corner. Be sure to keep the binding really nice and smooth. As we go around the corners, we don't want to sew any creases in the pad or the binding, so just smooth everything with your fingers as you go and ease the binding around the corners. A stiletto really helps to hold it in place. Note that I have not pinned or clipped the binding to the pad at all. Because I stretch the binding just a little as I sew, I find that it works best just to leave the binding loose and align it with the edges as I go around the pad. It's really important that the raw edges of the binding are aligned with the edges of the pad all the way around, and that you are sewing with a nice, accurate 1/4 inch seam. And you want to make sure that your foot is staying parallel to the edge. If that's all too much to handle, concentrate on keeping the binding smooth and even with the edges and the foot parallel to the piece. You can worry less about the accurate 1/4 inch seam so long as you stitch narrower than that. We can always go back and refine the seam later. Just don't stitch more than a 1/4 inch. When I get about 1 inch away from the rounded corner that is opposite the point where we started, I'm going to lengthen my stitch length. I want to stitch all the way around the corner so that I know how much fabric I have left when it's time to join, but there's a good chance that I'm going to need to unstitch part of the binding. Using a longer stitch makes that easier. Then I sew around until I'm about 1 inch in from the last corner. We'll stop here so that we can join the ends and finish attaching the binding. Our binding is partially attached to the pad, and we want to join the ends before we finish sewing it in place. I prefer to join the ends of the binding using a diagonal seam. This spreads the seam out so that I don't have a bulky lump, and everything lies nice and smooth. There are many methods for accomplishing this step. This is a method that always works for me. If you have a method that always works for you, by all means use it. To avoid confusion, let's start by naming the ends of the strip. The end on the right, with the 3 to 4 inch tail, will be end A. The end on the left, where we stopped sewing, will be end B. I start by moving end A, the 3 to 4 inch tail, out of the way to the right, and then pinning end B to the unbound section of the pad, giving it a bit of stretch as I align it. Then I position end A on top of end B and use pins to mark the points where the two strips intersect. Note that each end has a top and a bottom. This is the top and bottom of end A. This is the top and bottom of end B. Top and bottom of end B. In order to determine where to cut the fabric to join the ends, I need to mark the points where the ends meet. First, I'll mark the point where the top diagonal end of end A matches the top of end B by inserting a pin several times through the single layer of fabric on end B. Then I'll mark the point where the bottom diagonal end of end A, again which is on the bottom, matches the bottom on end B. Once these points are marked, I can unpin end B from the pad and move it away. I need to trim its excess length, so I want to open the strip and flatten it on my table. If you can't get the strip to lay flat, it's okay to remove a bit of stitching attaching end B to the pad. Because we lengthened the stitch length as we were sewing, that will be really easy. The pins that are inserted into the strip mark the points where the ends of the two strips meet. If I were to mark a line connecting these points and cut along that line, my two ends would match exactly. But I need to add a seam allowance to this strip before I cut. I want to join these strips together with a 1/4 inch seam. Because there is no seam allowance added to the other end, I need to double that amount on this end and add a 1/2 inch beyond the marked points to provide the two 1/4 inch seam allowances. For me, the easiest way to do that is to use these two handy triangle rulers. The angled ends allow me to make sure I'm cutting the proper angle on the ends, and they also allow me to work in tight areas. This ruler has lines marked every 1/4 inch, so I can align its 1/2 inch line right on top of each of the pins. Then I butt this triangle ruler up against the first ruler, making sure that the strip is aligned with the edges of the ruler along the sides too. Just move the strip as needed to get it aligned. Once I've got everything lined up, I can move the first ruler out of the way. Then I remove the pins and before cutting, I scoot this ruler up just a little bit, about 1/8 inch or so. Then I use my rotary cutter to cut along the edge of the ruler to trim end B. Finally, making sure that the ends aren't twisted, I'll bring the right sides of end A and end B together and align the ends, offsetting them a 1/4 inch on each end. I put several pins in this to hold the pieces together. I do not want it to come apart before it's sewn together. We'll sew the binding together with a 1/4 inch seam. Trying to keep it flat is probably the hardest part of the binding. Using a jumbo wonder clip to hold the pad together really helps. Once the seam is sewn, we'll press that seam open. I like to use the end of my pressing tool for this, since I can do it right at the machine and not fight with a large iron in this small space. To do that, just position the seam on a hard surface and rub the pressing tool part of the stiletto back and forth vigorously a few times on the seam. Once the ends are joined, we can finish stitching the binding to the pad. Fold the binding in half again and pin or clip in place if desired. The binding should fit the open space perfectly. Moving that ruler to make the strip a little bit shorter when we were trimming really helped combat the stretchiness of the bias. Align the raw edges of the binding with the raw edges of the pad and finish stitching in place. Then trim the dog ears on the binding so that they are even with the edge of the pad. Now we're ready to turn the binding to the front of the pad and stitch it down to enclose the raw edges. Before I begin stitching, I usually fold the binding over, all around the pad, making sure that the folded edge goes just past the line of stitching created when I attached the binding to the pad. If the folded edge of the binding goes much further beyond that line of stitching, I'll know that my seam allowance was too narrow, and I'll go back and refine that seam. If the folded edge doesn't go far enough to cover the line of stitching, I have some options. The seam allowance may be wider than a 1/4 inch, and I can either pick it or trim the seam allowance slightly. Or I can use the tip of my stiletto to pull the binding into place. This is usually my preferred method, as I prefer a tight, fully filled binding. Sometimes I will clip the binding in place all the way around, but usually I'll just test it and then start stitching. We'll sew along the folded edge of the binding, again using the stiletto to help hold the binding in place. Our goal is that the line of stitching on this side falls out in exactly the same place on the other side. When doing this, I really focus on taking it one stitch at a time and using the stiletto to precisely place the binding, especially around corners. Stitch all the way around the carrying strap pad, sewing just inside the folded edge, and your binding on the pad will be complete. Now you can insert the carrying strap into the pad. Just push the swivel hook on one end of the strap into the opening on the pad. Reach in from the other end to grab the swivel hook and pull the strap through. Adjust the pad so that it is centered on the strap. Use the swivel hooks on the end of the strap to attach the strap to the rings on the bag. My carrying strap pad is finished and my bag is ready to go. It will be so much easier to carry the bag with this pad on my shoulder. I hope that you enjoyed making a carrying strap pad too, and that you've learned how easy it is to get smooth, wrinkle-free bindings on curved edges using bias bindings. This skill will carry over to many of our other patterns too, so you're well on your way to many bag-making adventures. We can't wait to see what you make, so be sure to share pictures of your finished projects with us. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube by using @PatternsByAnnie, or email pictures to us at marketing@ByAnnie.com. Thank you so much for watching. Happy stitching!